So, Aza, it's been like a year since
Hmm.
we sat across each other, like from Zoom, I guess,
Yeah.
and spoke about the future of tech and humanity, which is like my favorite theme with you. And I love the theme this year because we're talking about emergence, and as we're kind of emerging from this pandemic, and there's so many different questions. Um, and I think back to our days in real life, like when we used to get to hang out in real life and not over Zoom. And we would for the folks who don't know, we'd like sit at bars and talk about like not normal things like the weaponization of loneliness and artificial intelligence and how we're soon going to be living in a Black Mirror episode. And then we all kind of started living in a Black Mirror episode over the last year. So we have so much jamming to do. So I guess I want to start this by asking you, as we emerge, as someone who is the voice of tech and humanity, what questions do you think that we need to ask ourselves about our relationship with tech as we begin to kind of come out and things are still going to be complicated?
Yeah. Um, I think one of the most important questions we should be asking ourselves is um, what from this period did we find valuable that we want to port forward? I
Right.
mean, there's been a lot of suffering. And also there's been a way, I think, for many of us, certainly for me, um, that there's been a kind of a back to ourselves movement, right? There's been more
Yeah.
baking, more like exercise bikes, more yoga, more um, family time, more long form time with a small group of people. In some ways, I think we all felt like, oh, this is some of what we were missing. And of
Right.
course, what's confusing, and I think we talked about this last time, is that we live in simultaneous utopia and dystopia. So at the same time as we were getting this long form time with the people that we care most about, we were also forced to interact with each other in sort of a photocopy of connection, like through our screens,
Yeah.
forced to make sense of the world through the binoculars, which are technology. Um, and I think we sit at this like very unusual juncture when we get to ask, what from this time, the great pause, do we want to continue on in our lives? And I think we're all sort of going through a kind of identity crisis right now, when we can just start to imagine, we can taste what the world post-pandemic might be like. And we sort of are sitting in between this, like imagining the future and flashback to the lives we used to have at the
Yeah.
same time as we've all become different people through the pandemic.
Right.
And so we're sort of now simultaneously these two versions of ourselves. It creates a wonderful moment for saying, well, what is most worth our attention now? And I think
Yeah.
holding that question, having that clean break from the past, is like the big gift that the pandemic offers. And the big pull is going to be the clock rate at which we're all moving. It's going to be much more, right? We're heading again into the roaring 20s. This has happened before.
Right.
The last flu, and the 20s were this time of sort of adulterous sort of like joy, which of course led to the stock market crash. And now we have to ask the question, what do we want this roaring 20s to be like? What is the tenor and the feeling?
What role do you think? I hear that too. I mean, this is gonna, maybe I shouldn't say this on this on this webinar, but I'm part time with 60 Minutes now. We're researching a story, and apparently even like sex clubs are up or something in New York, and we're researching a story on this right now, and we're talking, and they're talking about kind of this idea of the Roaring Twenties coming back in some way, and people just wanting to be out and about. So bringing it back to kind of to tech, which is our sweet spot. What role do you think technology is going to play in that acceleration of the roaring 20s?
Mm. Um, well, tech, is the great accelerator. I think um, my biggest hope for what technology could provide is that we've had enough of a break. But we've at the same time, we've seen enough of the effects of technology, and particularly information disintermediation technology, the technology that intermediates how we view ourselves, how we view our friends, how we view what's happening in society. We've now lived through the sort of the insurrection, the violence at the Capitol on January 6th. We've seen the sort of the cancer metastasize. The social dilemma is now out, right? Like it's came out right in the middle of the pandemic, has been seen by 130 million people, 190 countries. We just found out that like all the top Pentagon officials is now required watching for them. Wow. And it's really changed the conversation. And I think for the first time, we can all see that if technology does not change, things are just going to continually not go well. There's a kind of deranging effect that technology is having. And I think the hope is that now that we've all had that set of connections with each other, we can sort of anchor on like, what does a real connection look like as we think about, well, what trends are going to affect us into the future? I sort of think about it this way. Technology, these tech are a kind of brain implant into society, right? And they're rewiring society. And we in the West have a kind of brain implant that is hooking up every neuron to almost every other neuron. It's sort of like maximum broadcast. This is like the Twitter model, the Facebook model. And what do you expect to happen when you wire up every neuron to every other neuron? Except epileptic seizures. And we're sort of like, as a society, writhing on the ground, like foaming, like unable to understand or see all the other parts of ourselves. And then at the same time, we have China, which has a sort of like digital authoritarian kind of brain implant. And it has this sort of sociopathic efficiency to it. And you're like, the group of people that coordinates better generally wins. And the scary thing is like, those aren't our values, but it's being effective. And the biggest philosophical conundrum, I think, of our times is the trade-off between what is right and what works. And so I think the hope here is coming together in larger groups, all seeing the same frame and saying, well, we've made this implant. And the companies right now are just sort of experimenting on society in real time with no control. What does it take for us to create this implant? Because we can't take it out anymore. Yeah. What does it take for this implant to make a modern, functioning 21st century digital democracy that upholds our values? And I sort of think we need a new Bretton Woods, a new sort of digital convention that brings together all the smartest minds to figure out what would that really be.
It's funny you say that. And I think you mentioned the social dilemma for folks who are watching, like you were behind this film that went viral and you were part of it. And it was helpful because it put what we've all kind of been saying behind the scenes in the tech community into the mainstream, and had people talking about these issues of you are the product and the business model and what was so wrong with Silicon Valley and some of these things that are happening. And so, it kind of calls into the question, like what you're talking about, like a whole new digital democracy. Like we need just like everything needs to change. And I thought about it in the last year, I spent, since the last time we've seen each other, first of all, we're going to get into this, but since the last time we've seen each other, you've been trying to decode animal speech, because we're going to definitely get into that. And I've been at QAnon conventions and embedding with militias. So it's been an interesting year. But, one of the things when you talk about, the attack on the Capitol, I was thinking about this when I was with a whole bunch of members of QAnon, who just, not terrible people, by the way. I'll tell you this, like I was out in Jacksonville and I was with probably 200 people back in August who believed so fervently in QAnon. And I kept thinking to myself, these people were brainwashed by algorithms. And it was everything you and I had been talking about for so long. And the narrative and the polarization and everybody yelling at each other about how, crazy this is. I couldn't help but go back to some of our conversations and thinking to myself, we've got to completely change things if we want to actually see change. This can't just be these people are wrong and we're right and whatnot. This is actually coming, and it's stemming very deep from where I came up and covering Silicon Valley over a decade ago. You created some of the most powerful tools of our time. something has to completely shift if we're going to get out of this, and if we're going to have a healthier society. So as I sit in front of you, as we emerge from this moment, like, give us a little hope, like, what has to change? Because right now it feels like a lot of people who have politicized technology, a lot of people who hate the big tech companies, and there's regulation, and a lot of people who no longer, understandably so, trust some of the big tech companies and our data. Like, what do we got to do? What does digital
Yeah.
democracy even look like?
Yeah. Well,
That
I
was a
think
tirade.
here,
I'm sorry, but it's
no,
I think
I,
there's a lot of
I,
confusion.
I love it. And actually, it makes me very curious to dive in. I think what you said about, QAnon followers is really poignant, is that they're not terrible people. In fact, you could roll the dice and sort of realize, oh, it's any one of us could get caught up in a set of beliefs that then to somebody else looks crazy. Um, and which is not, I'm not making sort of any of like whataboutism or like everyone's right. But it's just sort of the empathy. Dan Vallone has this, who runs this peacekeeping org, More in Common. We've actually been doing sort of on your undivided attention, our podcast, a tour talking to many of the peacekeeping organizations, Bravery Angels, More in Common, Search for Common Ground, because they have 40, 50, 60 years of incredible experience of how do you bridge across divides in war-torn civil war countries. What can we learn and what can we port to technology? And Dan Vallone has honestly some of the most hopeful research I've ever run across. And it's about the perception gap. And so this is sort of like my takeaway from some of their work, but there's sort of two crises happening at once. There's the truth crisis, I think we're all familiar with, but there's the perception crisis, which is that we are not accurately seeing the other side. That is, when we are arguing with the other side, whatever that other side is, we're not actually arguing with them and their real beliefs. We're arguing with our mirage, our imagination, our stereotypes of what we think they believe. So here's an example. They poll people and they just say like, hey, Republicans, what percentage of Democrats do you think are LGBTQ? And Republicans estimate 30% of Democrats are LGBTQ. The actual number is less than 6%. And then they'll say like, hey, Democrats, what percentage of Republicans do you think all Muslims are bad for the US? And Democrats say 85%, 87%. In reality, it's less than 10%. And so we are often we believe we are much further apart than we actually are. We are much less polarized than we actually are. The more social media people use, in fact, the more media people watch, the greater the perception gap. It actually goes up 3x when you like fully immerse into social media or traditional media. And the higher the perception gap, the more likely you are to view the other side as disgusting, morally disgusting, brainwashed, idiotic, bigoted. You don't think they're coming from good faith. So imagine this. Imagine we had some legislation that says, well, Facebook, Twitter, Google, you have to use this kind of methodology to measure the perception gap, how incorrectly we are at perceiving the other side, which is really just a kind of nonviolent communication. And then you say, okay, for population content that increases the perception gap, you need to downregulate. And content that decreases the perception gap, you need to upregulate. That is like slow the spread of content that is keeping us from hearing and seeing each other accurately. And really, this is, as I said, this is like computational nonviolent communication. Nonviolent communication, it's like, hey, when you said this, this makes me feel this way. And is this what you really said? I heard this. Is that what you really said? And you go back and forth, that you actually see each other. Now, imagine if societies were running on top of infrastructure where the default wasn't to push us further apart in terms of perceptions, but pull us further together so we can really understand. Well, my hunch is, and this is a strong hypothesis, is that if you did that, the amount of polarizing content, extreme content, fake news, disinformation, clickbait, it would all diminish drastically, because when you think about it, all of those things are harvesting, they're preying on that false perception of the other side. And I think that gives a lot of hope looking into the future, where we're going to find this unlikely consensus, not by tackling the problem head on and saying, okay, well, we've created a business model which gives hate a home field advantage, and we're going to try to write AI that finds hate and get rid of that. And then we run into free speech issues. But he said, no, what's missing is the objective truth that we are missing each other, and these companies are profiting off of the incorrect perceptions of the other side. Let's solve that. And this is, I think, the coolest thing is that measuring truth is hard, right?
Yeah.
It's hard. That's what science is about. But measuring beliefs about the other side, really easy. That's objective. And now we can finally have objective measures for how to turn ourselves into a listening society.
That's fascinating. As a designer who is design, I mean, you're the person, I think probably a lot of people know this, but I always like to kind of say it when I'm interviewing you. You're responsible for the infinite scroll, like the reason we can keep scrolling. I was reading a transcript from an interview you did, and they said like 7 years later in a small hotel room, Asa sat down with a pen and paper and calculated that this one invention was responsible for wasting more than 200,000 lifetimes a day. How do you grapple with that? I mean, that's pretty extraordinary. Also, that's a pretty insane calculation. I'm not going to ask you to explain on this call how you came up with that, but that is pretty extraordinary if you think about that.
Yeah. And actually, that number is super conservative, because I was just assuming that people scrolled 50% more, but that number is much more likely to be like 10x more. So really, that number should be in like the 5 million to 10 million human lifetimes per day. And now like usage has gone up.
Like, do you ever sit there and you're like, well, that was me? Like, I mean, I maybe understand more kind of your life's work and how you're trying to make better design for technology, but what an extraordinary thing to have invented.
Yeah, well, it's sort of hard to look at, to be honest. It's hard to let into my nervous system. I can sit here and talk about it at a conceptual layer, but like, how do you really let in that something that you worked on, that you thought was a good idea, that you were doing your job well, right? Like, as a designer, like making a system efficient and convenient and function for an individual sort of seems to be your job.
Right.
But that's no longer good enough, right? Like, we are all making these brain implants into society. And, we need to now move with that kind of responsibility. I mean, I went through a dark night of the soul. We've had this conversation, to really grapple with what it was to believe so deeply in a set of values in the early web, like open communication, democratizing creativity, giving voice to that long tail of humanity. I really believe those things. And to realize that those beliefs are naive, and worse, that those naive beliefs gave rise to such immense harm, I don't think there's any way but to go through a kind of depression, which is what I went through. And I think that grieving process, like grief, is so important because it creates space for what comes next. It lets you open your eyes because you're no longer in denial, so you don't repeat the same mistakes again. I worry watching Web3 come up now, that I feel a lot of the similar things to Web 1. There's a similar kind of excitement. There's incredible idealism. This time there's a business model built in. But almost always, if you look at from television to radio to the internet, there's this golden era of a technology when it's just the people that are in it because they love to do it, right? And then at some point that golden era ends and market forces get involved, when entrenched powers are like, oh, that's a powerful thing. I'm gonna get involved. And we get a clash. And because there's the kind of like optimistic naivety of the early adopters, you end up in this sort of like gross mollification of the technology.
I would love to when you say, by the way, those are roosters in your background. I just to state the obvious for anyone who thinks there's a screaming person in your background. I think maybe that call from the roosters is bringing in this idea of Web 3.0. I am obsessed with this idea, and I don't know if people realize that we are on the cusp of another revolution of the internet. And it is fascinating, and it is strange, and it is also dangerous if we do not learn from our past mistakes. Like when you were talking about, I feel grief and I feel depression over, some of the decisions that were made over a decade ago, right? When you were this early pioneer of Web 2.0 and social and these with our phone and the things that that shaped, over the last decade. I am seeing the same excitement over this next phase of the internet. And maybe we can describe what Web 3.0 is. And I think it was accelerated by this pandemic, and it's happening now. Can you explain to us like what people are talking about when they say Web 3.0 and why it's exciting? And then maybe we can dig in a little bit to some of the ethical issues that we're not talking about yet, because I just had a moment. I was just in Mountain View, sitting across from an entrepreneur who's building out the metaverse and the next iteration of the web. And I literally had this scary thought, because I was talking to him and he was telling me about how he was going to change the world and how it was so exciting. And I'm sure his company will be worth billions soon, because they're about to put a huge thing of funding into it. And he couldn't answer questions of diversity. He couldn't answer all of the same questions that I asked founders over a decade ago that led us to some of these points. And it just scared me. So what is Web 3.0 for folks who don't know, and why is this period of time almost as important as it was over a decade ago?
Yeah. Before I answer the what is Web 3.0, that reminds me, whenever I hear the phrase, oh, we're going to change the world, I want to change the world. And I certainly recognize that also from an earlier version of myself. There's a wonderful quip. Yeah. Can't remember who said it. And it was like, when I was young, I always wished I could be someone. Yeah. And when I got older, I realized I should have been more specific. And I feel It's the same thing with these companies. It's like, oh, we want to change the world. And then they do and realize they should have been way more specific.
That's a great point.
Web3 is really, it's a set of technologies centered around decentralization. And it's often based on sort of blockchain technology, but really you just think of blockchain as a kind of way of being able to verify that somebody said something or owns something without a central figure. Sort of like, instead of going to the bank to figure out who owns the title to a property or to a car, there's a way of doing it so that there doesn't have to be a central bank. It's sort of like a set of maths so that you can verify that somebody owns something or has done something. And the first sets of technologies built on top of this were things like Bitcoin and Ethereum. What's interesting, I think, to me here is that one of the fundamental sins of Web 1.0 is that there wasn't a business model built in. And because there wasn't a business model, no one sat down intentionally to do it. It sort of emerged unintentionally, and we ended up with this sort of like ad-based, really, as Jaron Lanier says, like behavior change based business model, right? Google, Facebook, Twitter all make money based on the small changes to human behavior at scale. One of the biggest changes, and honestly, I'm still trying to figure out and project what this is going to mean, is the decentralized finance part of Web3, where even as of today, you can take loans out in real American cash against your cryptocurrency, use that to reinvest. My feeling is that this whole decentralized finance, as banks start to become irrelevant, are going to hit this side of our economic system like a dark horse. And I don't think we've yet grappled with it because it's sort of like still just a little bit in the undercurrents. Sure. But that's going to change everything. And so there's a whole bunch of really exciting parts. But some of the scary parts are, we haven't yet grappled with the unintended, or better said, unconsidered consequences of changing fundamentally the way our society's information flows work, say Facebook or Twitter or Google. And that's a centralized model. When something goes wrong, you can at least go and say, hey, you guys need to change this. In a fully decentralized world where we haven't learned those lessons, it's sort of like we've taken nuclear weapons, and instead of just giving them to a couple people and then trying to be like, okay, nuclear disarmament, we can figure something out, you've given them to everybody.
Right. Yeah, I think that's the thing that, and so I know it's like kind of heady to like to wrap, it's even to wrap your head around it. So it's like there are all these different spaces that are being built out that are almost decentralized, right? And it's a reaction towards places like Facebook and Twitter and the fact that we've been putting out our, that other places own our data, right? But now because of blockchain, because there's this other financial model, you know, there's these worlds being built out, right? And correct me if I'm wrong, that are super fascinating, that are more than just games on the web, right? That, you know, there's Decentraland, there's a place called Sandbox, and there are these whole other universes, right? That are going to be built out. And then when you add in augmented reality, and Apple's working on augmented reality, these things that are in these worlds are going to come into your view. And we are going to, and if this is what, and by the way, just go with me for a moment. And I know you'll go with me, Aza. You know, I hope I don't just like, you know, get pushed offline. But, you know, we could be entering a phase where we're living in a version of Ready Player One, right? And that's what these founders will tell you, right? And that's what some of these people are beginning to talk about when it comes to the next phase of the internet. This next phase is largely being built out by men who know crypto, who know blockchain. You know, a lot of it is owned, you know, by men, right? You know, and I think the founder I just spoke to, they were selling virtual real estate. They sold on one of their platforms, and they sold all of New York and San Francisco in the virtual world, right? And it all went to men. And I said, what about women on the platform? And he said, well, when we start opening up, you know, decorating and gardening. And I was like, are you kidding me? Like, I don't want to own gardens in the virtual world. I would own real estate if that's the future. And so I know this is super way into the future, but we were having the conversations, and I say this to say the conversations that you had in the social dilemma, while this hit mainstream and it was an important cultural conversation, you were having those conversations almost like a decade, right, before they hit mainstream. So if we do not have these conversations now about the future of the next iteration of the web, our children will be impacted. So I think it's such a fascinating, we are entering this next phase. So will you guys and the women in Silicon Valley learn from the last decade? Because God, there's a lot of lessons there, you know? Like, do you think other people are feeling the grief that you feel for some of these issues?
I think some people,
Yeah.
you know, like uh, watching, you know, Tim, who created the Facebook monetization model, like in the social
Right.
dilemma, say that he thinks that the greatest short-term threat from these algorithms, you pointed at sort of QAnon, but he's like, you know, the biggest threat is leading to civil war. And when he said that, like whatever it was, and they had interviewed 2 years ago before
Yeah.
the film eventually came out, like that felt like it was outside the Overton window. Like people are like,
Right.
that's you're saying too far. But January 6th happens. You're like, no, like
Right.
these technologies have massive impact because they are transforming who we are at the what we pay attention to level, at the what we read and the news we process. We are the people we spend time with. Remember the set of the 5 people we're closest with. It changes what we see from them and who those people are. It changes at the values level. And the
Right.
values that we put into our technology is now so totalizing. We spend so much time with it. It's the thing we wake up to. We look at it before we pee. It's the last thing we look at before we go to sleep. We spend more time with our technology than with our significant others or our spouses. Like it's so totalizing that the rules that we put into its walls become us, right? Like we live in an attention economy, and you know, it's no longer enough, of course, just to like grab people's attention. It's much cheaper if we can get people addicted to needing attention, right? That's Facebook and Instagram and TikTok. Now, the number one thing that kids want to be in the US when they grow up, it used to be like astronauts and teachers and fire
Yeah.
trucks. Now, the number one thing is an influencer, right? The
Right.
value that we taught our AIs we wanted, which was engagement, attention, became the values that we as individuals hold. And now it's as if we've been programmed. We're like, you know, the golem, a slip has been put into our mind that changes all of our behavior. And what's so scary is the are things happening faster or slower now than in Web 1? Well, they're happening, of course, much faster. So the
Right.
clock rate at which these new technologies get deployed and hit society are speeding up. And it's as if we're driving a car and the rate at which we can turn the wheel has not gone up,
Right.
but the speed at which we're traveling is increasing and increasing and increasing. And at some point, you just lose control. I think addressing that fundamental clock rate issue is so critical. Sort of E.O. Wilson, I think I bring this up every time we talk, but it's just such a profound point, has this quote that the problem humanity faces is that we have medieval institutions, sorry, that we have Paleolithic emotions, medieval institutions, and increasing and accelerating godlike technology. And what
Yeah.
we need to do is embrace those Paleolithic emotions, be honest about them, that clear-eyed, compassionate look at who we are, the good and the bad, the light and the shadow of our souls. Upgrade our medieval institutions. And I think Taiwan, some of the conversation we were just having around solving the perception gap
Yeah.
problem or the perception crisis is part of that. And then giving ourselves the wisdom to wield those godlike technologies.
Yeah. I mean, so let's look at, I guess we spoke a year ago, right, at this time. And I think we talk about how quickly technology moves. And anytime you have an event that's disruptive, like say a pandemic, technology accelerates. So if we were to
Yeah.
take a step back, and I love asking tech founders this question. I've asked everybody this question. And I think I've probably asked you this question before too, but I love asking it at different points. What do you think is the single most important ethical question we should be asking when it comes to the future, or the single most important ethical issue when it comes to the future of technology and us complicated human beings?
Yeah. So I think this is a great time to talk about philosophical bankruptcy. Um, and so we just did a podcast with Yuval Harari, and that was his term, philosophical bankruptcy. And what we were talking about is really the Western world, sort of Enlightenment onward, but let's say 18th century. We follow this maxim of like, trust your gut. The customer is always right. The voter always knows best. That the individual lived sense is the place that decision making, wise decision making, should come from. And actually, that makes a lot of sense. Like the reason why democracies rose, sort of at the nation level, is because before monarchies were actually pretty good because you wanted that centralized decision making. Because there just wasn't a way of communicating from the edges of a nation to the other edges of the nation. People just couldn't talk enough to share information to make a good decision as a whole. Imagine like a nation as a organism, and it's sort of like the left arm doesn't know what the right arm is doing, so you have to have a brain somewhere in the center.
Right.
Democracies, really, with the rise of printing press, but then like telephone, all of these kinds of like communication technologies really rewired the society and made it possible for individuals to have enough access to information to make good decisions.
Yeah.
And we are going through another phase shift now, where technology's power, the ability to totalize, to generate images that uniquely stimulate us, to give us feeds that uniquely entrap us, are such that we are entering an era where we cannot trust as much our senses,
Yeah.
where the air itself in our digital environments becomes persuasive. We talked about this a number of times, but as an example, right? Google can now, using a technology called style transfer, read every email you've ever written and learn to write in your style. In fact, that's what Tab autocomplete does. But then they can read every email that you've responded to positively, responded to quickly, and learn the style that's uniquely persuasive to you. And you have no antibodies to deal with something like this. Like TikTok right now, like captures people so quickly because it figures out with its AI exactly the kind of person that you're most interested in doing what, like you're into rock climbers that look specifically like this, and it just starts feeding you. Well, think about what happens in the next like 5 years, as instead of just waiting until that content they discover it, they start generating it using deep fakes. And it's content that's like just for your particular psyche. And it
Right.
starts drifting you from the beliefs you are to whatever belief they want you to have, right? We were just talking to somebody high up in China who said that, TikTok is already starting to use it, unsurprisingly, for propaganda, just small videos that are
Yeah.
about like indoctrinating into the Chinese way of life. I mean, the US would probably do the same thing using our technology. The point is not like, oh, evil. It's the point is that when you control somebody's context and the way they see, and you have an asymmetric power about, say, what Google knows about you, like, and Uber and all these other companies, they know like who you're sleeping with, if you're having an affair, what drugs you're on, like how tired you are, how much is your current cognitive load, just looking at like the dilation of your iris, if you're depressed, if you've lost your job, if you're likely to change your job, like the list just goes
Yeah.
on. They know more about
Right.
us strictly than our lawyers and our doctors combined. And so the idea that our democracies are based on the customer is always right, the voter knows best, trust your guts and trust your hearts, that's the basis on which government works right now. As we
Right.
move into fully the 21st century, we can no longer trust those things. On what basis are we making decisions? And what basis is democracy working? And that is the philosophical bankruptcy and the sort of the true philosophical singularity. And we're like, well, how are we going to make decisions when
Yeah.
when we've lost that kind of agency? Right? We say this at the end of the film. It's Justin Rosenstein has this wonderful quote, which is, um, uh, we live in a world where whales are worth more dead than alive, and trees are worth more as lumber than as trees. And human beings are now worth more as dead slabs of predictable human behavior than we are as beautiful, living, effervescent, ineffable creatures, right? Like living full, rich lives. And so long as we live in an economic logic that treats human beings as resources to exploit, we are always going to be distracted, polarized, isolated, and lonely. And that's the problem that we need to solve. And that's, frankly, it's a hard conversation because you're like, that's a change of the economic logic.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, well, first of all, let me state the obvious. That's depressing,
Yep.
but fascinating, which seems to be the
As were
premise
most of
of
our
a lot of. I
conversations.
was about to say that that seems on par for most of the conversations we have. So here's a question. So I remember years ago, I was interviewing, and this kind of goes off of what you're saying. And I have a feeling I know what you're going to say. But I was interviewing a guy at CNN years ago who does predictive data analytics. I think I've told you the story maybe.
Mm-hmm.
Like he does predictive data analytics to determine if something really bad is going to happen. Like, and this goes into kind of these companies being able to know everything that's going to happen or know so much about you. And he could tell if like a suicide bombing was going to happen with a certain
Mm-hmm.
level of accuracy, right? And this isn't rocket science. Like they can look at all these different factors. But in the middle of the interview, and we never used this part because Lori had control over the tape and it was taped. And he said to me in the middle of the interview, I analyzed all your data. And I was like, what? He's like, I analyzed everything you said on Facebook, Twitter, everything over the last like 8-9 years, I'm a semi-public figure, and I was like, well, what'd you find? And he looked at me point blank and he was like, you're unhappy in your relationship and you're growing unhappy at your job.
Mm-hmm.
And like, a couple of years later, I left said relationship and said job, and not because he said it, which you could argue in all these ways. And so I've always wondered, right? Like, and when I left, I called him up and I said, how'd you do? Like, cause it always kind of stuck in my mind. I called him Data Man because it just was like
Mm-hmm.
fascinating. And I always wondered, like, and I called him and he said, every word you tweet, the time of day you tweet, the types of words you use, these are all these digital puzzle pieces that when put together create a picture of what you're not saying, right? Like I'd never been like, I think I'm a little antsy. I want to go create my own thing. I never said that, or I never said like, I'm having, I don't know if this is the one, like,
Yeah.
no. But I wonder, and correct me if I'm wrong, is there a way, since we talk about control and how much we've lost control, like how much we are these like slabs of data to some degree. Like, would there ever be a way that we could use our data for us, to serve us, to be able to wonder, hey, my GPS like says that I'm falling into depression because I've been moving around. I'm getting pinged because it shows that the word types I've been using are different, and maybe I'm not the happiest in this relationship. I don't know. This is very Black Mirror, but just go with me. Like, is there a world where we could use our data in the way that we are being used as the product to productize ourselves?
Yeah. I mean, it's a fascinating question. And, one of the fundamental paradoxes of technology is the more data about us we feed it, the better it can serve us and the
Right.
better it can exploit us. I
Right.
mean, it's generally true. I think it's a really interesting possible. Trying to look at some of the utopian futures that might be possible.
Yeah.
And it's honestly very hard and unsettling to try to do so, because you're like, okay, let's really imagine, take the business model out. Technology is really just here to serve us. Like, we've got fiduciary duty so that all companies are beholden to serving in our best interest. And when they're not, they get sued in class action lawsuits. And we have the right other sort of like tax incentives. Okay, so that's been solved somehow. Um, what does that utopian future look like when my refrigerator has crunched the data and actually knows the perfect partner for me? And it's not wrong. It's like,
Right.
cool, like, go talk to this person. You're going to discover, like, and you're going to be incredible parents together. And also, then my toaster oven is like, this is the job for you.
Right.
Like, I've crunched everything. I've seen how you lather
Yeah.
your toast. This is like, you need to go do X, right? And you do it and you're really happy. And
Yeah.
in fact, every time your technology says, like, we've crunched the data, this is the thing, like, it's not wrong. Something
Yeah.
about that still feels really unsettling to me, but I
Right.
can't point exactly my
Yeah.
finger at why. Um,
Right.
like,
I don't know.
yeah.
I'm with you.
And
I always, it strikes me. I don't know. Like, cause I always thought, well, what if that data, I don't know, but
well,
I want to, no, go
and so
ahead.
this is maybe like a way to start thinking about it, because it's hard to say, like, what, it's sort of like answering the question, like, what is health? Like, it's really hard to
Hmm.
point your finger and be like, oh, this is health, but we can certainly say some things are healthier than other things. So I
Yeah.
think we can say some things in the future are better than other things. One of them might be, well, there is such a thing as developmental stages, right? Like, levels of consciousness. Kids go through it. At some point, they don't understand object permanence, right? Like, you hide behind your hands and you literally disappeared, and then you come back and you're there. Then they learn object permanence. There is a stage of theory of mind where, before, like, I as a kid can't model what you're thinking, and there's a stage after which I can, and I get empathy with you. I can understand what you're going through.
Yeah.
Um, and over there's a German term Bildung, which is the lifelong development. So it's sort of like continuing up those evolution, those cognitive stages of development, emotional stages of development. Imagine if technology were tuned for not developing us for us, but rather creating the conditions in which it's giving us the good kind of stress, the eustress, so that we are developing ourselves. So it's more about
Right.
gardens rather than carpentry. And it's
Yeah.
about helping us step through our own stages of development, so that everyone is constantly sort of like going to the adjacent possible version of themselves, which is just a little bit more aware and a little bit more developed. That, I think, could be a really cool world.
Yeah. Well, I know we have to close in a little bit, but we can't close it without, we have like the rooster in the background. And I think this is a good segue into some of your latest work, which is, I think a lot of us spent the pandemic, in worrying, obviously, but, thinking about our lives and our friendships. And um, part of what you spent your pandemic doing is using machine learning to decode what animals are saying, which seems pretty on par for you. But it's, your latest work is trying to really understand if a world where we could speak to animals. Could you just
Yeah.
explain what that looks like, what you're doing, how far along are you? And I don't want to simplify it by being like, when can we speak to our dogs? Because I know that's what everyone says to you, but how fascinating. What are you
Yeah.
doing?
So this is the Earth Species Project. The roosters agree.
What did the rooster say? Just what did the
that was the
algorithm? What
rooster
did the
just saying like,
algorithm?
let's
Yeah.
go.
Right.
Um,
Okay.
um, yeah, so it's the Earth Species Project. We've been working on it since 2017. This is like with my co-founder Britt Selvatel, Katie Zakarian, and we're doing exactly what you said. There's some new technology that gives hope that you can translate potentially an animal language, and it works by it actually lets you translate. Most people, this sort of slipped by, but we can now, as human beings, translate between any two human languages, or pretty much any two human languages, without the need for a Rosetta Stone or any examples of how to translate this, right? Like I give you a book in a language you don't understand, a different book in a different language you don't understand, and somehow you can translate them. So we're using that technology, this almost sort of universal translation technology, to try to understand animal communication. And the way the technology works, I just have to say a little bit about it because it's so amazingly cool and I think profound, is that it lets you build a shape out of language. So imagine a galaxy where every star is a word, and words that mean similar things are near each other, and the relationship between things is encoded geometrically. So, like dog has a relationship to wolf, has a relationship to man, has a relationship to cat, has a relationship to groups, has a relationship to fur. And if you think about the set of all relationships that a dog might have, it sort of fixes it in a point in space. And it turns out that across all human cultures, or at least most human cultures, there are similar sets of relationships. Dog still has a similar-ish relationship to man, a similar-ish relationship to cats across all cultures. And so when you take the shape which is Chinese and the shape which is German, you can just rotate one shape on top of the other and they match up. And the point which is dog is sort of the same in both. And that works not across just German and Chinese, but Esperanto and Finnish and Turkish and Aramaic. Most human languages, almost all human languages, seem to share a kind of universal shape. And I just think that is so beautiful because in a time of such deep division, the fact that there's this hidden similarity uniting us all, I think is just fantastic. And then, of course, the question is, well, can we build the shape for animal communication? And of course, you can. And then if you do, does it fit anywhere into the universal human meaning shape? And, humans have been around speaking for maybe 60,000 years. Dolphins have been around communicating vocally for 40 million years. Imagine the wisdom that's encoded in their cultures. And I should say, dolphins and whales have cultures. They have dialects. They have grief, like, orcas, their babies die. They will carry their baby around for a while. There's a lot in our world which is the same. And so maybe we'd expect to find some kind of overlap in these structures. But of course, there's a lot about the world which is completely different. When they see with their sonar, right, they get a full 3D map back. They see where your bones are. They see how much you've eaten. And in fact, there's a set of scientists that think that maybe sperm whales speak as these kind of 3D sounds, and they just are beaming images back and forth to each other. We'll find out. But we'd expect some part of their experience to not overlap. And I don't know which one of these is going to be more fascinating, the part that we can directly translate and build our Rosetta Stone, or the part that we're like, that is not directly translatable into the human experience. Isn't that where the true wisdom is going to be? And then we can start asking questions about it. And for us, and this is two stories. This is a story of the science. And, we've partnered with like all the top universities and biologists because it's really their hard work that we get to operate on top of. And then there's this other part, which is this is really another culture change conversation, right? Like language is so important to us as human beings, right? Like in the beginning, there was the word. In the Ayurvedic traditions, the universe starts with the Om. Civilization can only happen because we speak. Language is so core to human identity. And I think the shift that we need to see, it's sort of like these AI technologies are the invention of modern optics, because like the invention of optics gave us the telescope and it gave us the microscope. The microscope let us, see bacteria, understand disease, know that we were made up of cells. Ernst Haeckel's, one of the proteges of Darwin, spent like much of his life looking one eye through a microscope at microscopic entities and the other half sketching what he saw. That became art forms in nature, which started the Art Nouveau movement. So it's changed everything. And then the telescope let us look at the universe and be like, oh, you know what? Earth is not at the center of the universe. And I think the goal here really with their species is to be a force multiplier for every other conservation, climate, environmental cause, because it lets us look out at the universe, the other beings on the planet, make first contact with another intelligent species, and discover that, hey, it's human beings that are not at the center of the universe.
I think that's so perfect that you have like birds now chirping in your background. It's just like a perfect way to ask my last question, which is, you've done so much, and you've really contributed, I think, to humanity with your work in technology and what you've done. How do you want to be known at the end of this?
Well, one, just thank you. That's I really feel that when you say it. I just wake up in my meat suit every day and try to do the best and talk to as many smart people as I know to figure out in which ways can do the best. I think when asked that question, I think my mind immediately goes to like, oh, what do you want your legacy to be? And I think it's very easy to get caught up in nouns versus verbs. And I think most human suffering comes from a confusion of nouns and verbs, right? Like when one child sees another child playing with a toy, what they want is the verb, they want the fun, but the only thing that they can take is the noun. They take the toy and then both kids are unhappy because they wanted fun, they took the toy, and now neither one is having fun. And so I don't think I want to be remembered for any of my nouns, like things that you do. What I want to be remembered for, if at all, is two things. One is that I live my life with integrity. And what do I mean by integrity? I mean that I've lived with my motivations matching my values. And two, that the agency with which I move in the world matches the agency I actually have. I think we're all stuck with images of ourselves that are ourselves in the past. When you think about who you are, you always think about a younger version of yourself.
Yeah.
And there is a way in which we are not yet honest about the actual agency we have to make change. And it's a constant process and practice for me to try to ask in which ways do I have agency now that I'm not yet awake to.
Cool. Great answer. Well, this is great. And I can't wait till next year when hopefully we don't have like another pandemic or anything terrible happen. And hopefully we can do this in real life.
Yeah, that'd be amazing. I'll just say one thing is that I was in a small group gathering yesterday, and somebody just turned and is like, wow, this is such an amazing call. And it all sunk into us. So like, we're in person. You just said call, like that became our world. That was the default.
Right.
And I'm very excited that, as the vaccines get further out into the world, we can start having those real connections while maintaining some of that long form slowness that fits the ergonomics of who we are so much better.
It'd be a nice way to emerge. Yeah. Thank you.